Picture this. It's 1947. A violent thunderstorm rages across Dearborn, Michigan. The electricity has failed across the entire region. And inside a 56-room mansion, surrounded by 1,300 acres of darkness, an 83-year-old man lies dying by candlelight. This man changed the world. He put America on wheels. He created the middle class. He paid workers wages that were considered insane. He was, at one point, the richest man on earth. But he was also something else. Something darker. He was a man who received a medal from Nazi Germany, a man who kept a personal army, a man whose workers lived in terror, a man who built mansions filled with secrets, tunnels, and surveillance systems that would make modern intelligence agencies jealous. His name was Henry Ford. And today, we're going to explore something that nobody talks about. The haunting, twisted, absolutely bizarre story of Henry Ford's mansion empire, a collection of estates that still stand today, holding secrets that have never been fully revealed. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about one of America's most celebrated industrialists. So sit back, turn off the lights if you dare, and let's dive into one of the most unsettling tales of American wealth, power, and obsession ever told. This is the story they don't teach you in school. Let's begin. Before we can understand the mansions, we need to understand the man. Henry Ford was born on July 30, 1863, on a farm in Springwells Township, Michigan. His childhood was complicated. His mother, Mary, died when Henry was just 12 years old. This event shattered him in ways that would echo throughout his entire life. Ford later said that the house became like a watch without a mainspring after her death. Remember that phrase. It's going to become important later. Young Henry despised farm work. He found it monotonous, brutal, and primitive. While other farm boys dreamed of bigger harvests, Henry dreamed of machines. He would take apart every watch, every mechanical device he could find, studying their inner workings with an obsession that bordered on the supernatural. His father wanted him to inherit the farm. Henry had other plans. At 16, he walked away from the farm and headed to Detroit. He would return to that farmland decades later, but not as a farmer. He would return as something else entirely. He would return as a king. Now we arrive at the heart of our story. In 1914, Henry Ford was already the most talked-about industrialist in America. The Model T was revolutionizing transportation. The assembly line was changing manufacturing forever, and Ford's controversial decision to pay workers $5 a day, more than double the average wage, made headlines worldwide. Henry Ford was becoming something America had never seen before, a celebrity businessman. But here's where things get interesting. Despite his immense wealth, Ford and his wife Clara were living in a relatively modest house on Edison Avenue in Detroit. For a man who was rapidly becoming one of the richest people on the planet, this was unusual. Then, in 1914, Ford made a decision that would define the rest of his life. He purchased 1,300 acres of land along the Rouge River in Dearborn, Michigan. This wasn't just any land. Part of it was the same property where he had been born. Part of it was where his mother had lived before her death. Ford was going back. But he wasn't going back to farm. He was going back to build an empire. The estate was named Fair Lane, after the area in Ireland where Ford's ancestors had originated. And what Ford built there was unlike anything America had ever seen. The main house was a 31,000-square-foot mansion designed by architect William Van Tyne, with significant input from Ford himself. It contained 56 rooms, including multiple kitchens, a bowling alley, an indoor pool, and amenities that seemed almost science fiction for the era. But here's where the story takes its first dark turn. Ford didn't just build a house. He built a self-sustaining fortress. Beneath the mansion, Ford constructed a massive powerhouse on the Rouge River. This wasn't just a backup generator. This was a complete, independent power plant capable of generating electricity for the entire estate, and then some. Ford wanted to be completely independent of the outside world. But why? The answer reveals something disturbing about Ford's psychology. You see, by 1914, Ford had become deeply paranoid. His success had brought him enemies, real and imagined. Labor organizers despised him, competitors wanted to destroy him, and Ford became convinced that dark forces were working against him. Forces he would later identify in the most disturbing way possible. But we'll get to that. For now, understand this. Fair Lane wasn't just a mansion, it was a statement, it was a fortress, and it was filled with secrets that took decades to fully discover. Let's talk about what they found under Fair Lane. When researchers and historians began seriously studying the estate after Clara Ford's death in 1950, they discovered something remarkable. Tunnels, not just one tunnel, an entire network of underground passages connecting various buildings on the estate. Some of these tunnels were practical, connecting the main house to the powerhouse, for instance, but others seemed to serve no obvious purpose. One tunnel led to a hidden observation room, where someone could watch the main driveway without being seen. Another connected to a concealed entrance in the gardens. The full extent of the tunnel system has never been completely mapped. But here's what makes it even stranger. Ford had installed an extensive intercom system throughout Fair Lane. This wasn't unusual for a wealthy home of that era. What was unusual was how Ford used it. According to multiple accounts from servants and workers, Ford would sometimes sit in a hidden room and listen to conversations happening throughout the house. He monitored his staff. He monitored visitors. He even, according to some accounts, monitored his own wife. Remember, this was decades before electronic surveillance became common. Ford was ahead of his time in many ways, including his paranoia. But the tunnels and the listening devices were just the beginning. Fair Lane also contained what can only be described as a shrine. Henry Ford had an obsession. Actually, he had many obsessions, but one of them would shape Fair Lane in ways that still confuse historians today. Ford believed that modern society was fundamentally corrupt. He believed that industrialization, yes, the same industrialization he was profiting from, was destroying something essential about the American character. His solution: recreate the past. Throughout the Fair Lane estate, Ford attempted to build his vision of a pure, pre-industrial America. He constructed working farms. He built old-fashioned craftsmen's workshops. He even created a complete one-room schoolhouse where local children would be educated in traditional values. But his strangest project was the gardens. Ford and Clara created elaborate gardens throughout the estate, featuring thousands of birds. Ford had constructed elaborate birdhouses throughout the property and maintained them obsessively. At its peak, Fair Lane was home to over 500 birdhouses and an estimated population of thousands of songbirds. Ford would spend hours sitting in the gardens, watching the birds, seemingly at peace. But here's the disturbing context. During the same years Ford was creating his pastoral paradise at Fair Lane, he was also doing something else. He was publishing the most anti-Semitic newspaper in American history. I told you this story was going to get dark. In 1918, Ford purchased a newspaper called the Dearborn Independent. Over the next 7 years, this newspaper would publish some of the most hateful anti-Semitic content ever seen in American media. Ford blamed Jewish people for everything he despised about modern society: jazz music, short skirts, Hollywood, Wall Street, labor unions. In 1920, the newspaper began publishing a 91-week series that would later be compiled into a 4-volume book called The International Jew. This book was translated into 16 languages. It was praised by Adolf Hitler, who kept a portrait of Ford in his office. In 1938, on Ford's 75th birthday, the Nazi government awarded him the Grand Cross of the German Eagle, the highest honor Nazi Germany could give to a foreigner. Ford accepted it. Now here's where this connects to Fair Lane. While Ford was publishing hatred and receiving Nazi medals, he was also retreating more and more to his pastoral paradise. He was creating an elaborate fantasy of rural American purity while simultaneously promoting ideologies of ethnic hatred. The contradiction is staggering. And it gets worse. Ford created something called the sociological department at his company. This wasn't what it sounds like. This was essentially a private police force that would investigate Ford workers' personal lives. They would visit workers' homes unannounced. They would check whether workers were drinking alcohol, saving money properly, keeping their homes clean, and living according to Ford's standards. Workers who didn't meet these standards could be fired or have their wages reduced. Ford was building a surveillance state decades before the technology existed to make it easy. And Fair Lane was the command center. But Fair Lane wasn't Ford's only mansion. Let's travel south. In 1925, Ford purchased a 70,000-acre estate in Georgia called Richmond Hill Plantation. This property had its own dark history. It had been a major slave plantation before the Civil War. Ford transformed Richmond Hill into a winter retreat, but he did something unusual there. He attempted to recreate the antebellum South, complete with working plantations, traditional crafts, and what Ford described as simpler ways of living. The racial implications of a man known for antisemitism nostalgically recreating a slave plantation are obvious. Ford also maintained properties in Fort Myers, Florida, next door to his close friend Thomas Edison. The two would vacation together, along with other famous friends like Harvey Firestone and sometimes even President Warren Harding. They called themselves the Vagabonds, and they would go on elaborate camping trips together. But make no mistake, these weren't ordinary camping trips. They traveled with servants, chefs, and every luxury imaginable. Ford's Fort Myers home, called Mango's, still stands today as a museum. Visitors describe an unsettling feeling walking through rooms where Ford and Edison discussed their views on race, genetics, and human superiority. Both men were enthusiastic supporters of eugenics, the pseudoscientific belief that humanity could be improved through selective breeding. The homes where they discussed these ideas still stand, preserved for tourists. Now let's talk about something that sounds like a conspiracy theory, but is actually documented historical fact. Henry Ford maintained a private security force that functioned as a personal army. The most notorious figure in this organization was Harry Bennett, who Ford hired in 1916. Bennett was a former Navy boxer with connections to organized crime. He was tough, ruthless, and completely loyal to Ford. Under Bennett's leadership, Ford's service department grew into something terrifying. They employed thousands of men, many of them former criminals, boxers, and even members of organized crime families. Their official job was plant security. Their actual job was much broader. They broke up union organizing efforts, sometimes violently. They surveilled workers. They intimidated anyone who crossed Ford. They maintained networks of informants throughout Ford's factories and allegedly throughout Dearborn itself. And here's the connection to Fair Lane. Harry Bennett had his own house on the Fair Lane property. It was located on an island in the Rouge River, accessible only by a drawbridge that could be raised in case of attack. Yes, you heard that right. Ford's security chief lived in what was essentially a castle with a moat and a drawbridge. Bennett's house allegedly contained hidden rooms, escape tunnels, and secret compartments. According to some accounts, it also contained a firing range where Bennett trained his men. This wasn't security. This was a private military. And it operated for decades, right under the noses of American authorities. On May 26, 1937, Ford's private army made national headlines in the worst possible way. Union organizers from the United Auto Workers attempted to distribute pamphlets to workers at Ford's River Rouge plant. They positioned themselves on an overpass near the plant entrance. What happened next was captured by newspaper photographers, creating some of the most iconic images of the American labor movement. Ford's service department men attacked the organizers. They beat them bloody right there on the overpass in full view of the press. One organizer, Walter Reuther, was kicked in the head and thrown down a flight of iron stairs. The photographs made national and international news. Ford's response. He claimed the organizers had attacked his security men first. He denied everything. But the photographs told a different story. The Battle of the Overpass marked the beginning of the end for Ford's private army. Public opinion turned against him. Government investigations followed. And eventually, in 1941, Ford was forced to allow unionization at his plants. But here's the part of the story that nobody talks about. While all this was happening, the violence, the investigations, the public outcry, Henry Ford was spending more and more time at Fair Lane. He was retreating into his fortress. He was building more birdhouses. And according to some accounts, he was losing his mind. In 1938, Henry Ford suffered the first of several strokes. The man who had revolutionized American industry, who had created the modern assembly line, who had changed how humanity moved and worked and lived, that man was dying. But he refused to accept it. Ford continued to run his company, even as his mental faculties deteriorated. He made increasingly erratic decisions. He fired competent executives. He promoted Harry Bennett to positions of even greater power. And he retreated further into Fairlane. During the 1940s, according to servants and family members, Ford would sometimes wander the estate at night. He would talk to the birds. He would visit the powerhouse and sit by the generators. He would walk through the gardens where he and Clara had spent so many hours. Some accounts describe him as peaceful. Others describe something more disturbing. Ford would sometimes speak to people who weren't there. He would reference events that had happened decades earlier as if they had occurred yesterday. He would ask about his mother, who had died more than 60 years before. The mansion that had been built as a monument to power was becoming a prison of memory. And then came the flood. On April 7, 1947, the Rouge River flooded. Heavy rains and snowmelt had overwhelmed the river's banks, and water poured into the powerhouse that Ford had built to make Fairlane independent of the outside world. The generators failed. The lights went out. For the first time in decades, Fairlane was dark. Ford was carried to his bedroom by candlelight. The modern world he had done so much to create had failed him at the end. His house, with all its technology and innovation, was reduced to what any house would have been in the era of his birth. That night, surrounded by candles, attended by his wife Clara and servants, Henry Ford died. He was 83 years old. According to witnesses, his last hours were peaceful. He spoke quietly to Clara. He drifted in and out of consciousness, and then he was gone. The man who had changed the world died in darkness, in a mansion filled with secrets, surrounded by the estate he had built to recreate a past that never really existed. It was, in its way, poetic. It was also deeply strange. Now we arrive at the part of the story that brings us to the title of this documentary. After Henry Ford's death, Clara continued to live at Fairlane. She maintained the estate, cared for the birds, and lived quietly until her own death in 1950. The estate then passed to the Ford Motor Company, which donated it to the University of Michigan Dearborn. The property was eventually opened to public tour. And that's when the reports began. Tour guides and visitors have reported strange experiences at Fairlane for decades. Footsteps in empty hallways, the sound of someone playing the estate's pipe organ when no one is there, figures glimpsed in windows, cold spots in rooms where the temperature should be constant. One of the most commonly reported phenomena involves the birds. Remember Ford's obsession with birds, the hundreds of birdhouses, the thousands of songbirds he maintained. After Ford's death, the bird population declined dramatically. The elaborate birdhouses fell into disrepair. The estate became quieter. But visitors report hearing birdsong in areas where no birds are present. They report flocks of birds that appear suddenly and then vanish. They report the feeling of being watched from the gardens, even when no one else is visible. Now I want to be clear about something. I'm not telling you that Fairlane is definitely haunted. I'm telling you that people report experiences there that they struggle to explain. Whether those experiences are supernatural, psychological, or simply the result of an old house settling and creaking, that's for you to decide. But there's something undeniably eerie about walking through the halls where Ford conducted his surveillance, where he retreated from the consequences of his hatred, where he died in darkness as the flood waters rose. Fairlane feels like a place where something happened. Something that hasn't entirely ended. Today, Fairlane still stands. The powerhouse has been partially restored. The gardens have been renovated. Tours are available for visitors who want to experience one of America's most unusual estates. But much of the house remains in need of repair. The tunnels are mostly sealed off. The intercom system, Ford's surveillance network, is no longer functional. And the birdhouses are mostly empty. Meanwhile, Ford's other properties have met various fates. Richmond Hill Plantation was sold after Ford's death, and eventually became part of the Fort McAllister Historic Park. The antebellum fantasy Ford created there has been largely dismantled, though some structures remain. The Fort Myers estate has been converted into a museum celebrating Ford and Edison's friendship. Visitors can tour the homes, see the laboratories, and learn about two geniuses who shaped the modern world while holding views that we now recognize as monstrous. It's a strange experience. You walk through beautiful grounds, you see incredible innovations, and you know that the men who lived there believed things that we now correctly identify as evil. How do we reconcile these contradictions? This is the challenge Ford's mansions present to us. Here's what I keep coming back to. Henry Ford built Fair Lane as a retreat from the modern world. He filled it with birds and gardens and old-fashioned craftsmanship. He tried to recreate a pastoral past that existed more in imagination than reality. But he also filled it with tunnels and listening devices and surveillance systems. He made it a fortress. He staffed it with guards from his private army. He was simultaneously trying to escape modernity and control it. He was trying to create paradise while funding hatred. He was trying to find peace while employing violence. The contradictions are maddening, and I think that's why Fair Lane feels so unsettling to visitors. It's not just that it might be haunted by Ford's ghost. It's that it's haunted by Ford's contradictions, by the tension between the man who wanted to return to simpler times and the man who helped create the complex modern world, by the man who said he wanted peace for all people and the man who published hatred against millions, by the man who built a paradise and filled it with fear. These contradictions don't resolve. They just hang there, in the empty rooms, in the overgrown gardens, in the silent birdhouses. Ford's mansion empire tells us something important about American wealth and power. It tells us that you can build paradise and still be tormented, that you can control everything around you and still feel powerless, that you can have all the money in the world and still die in darkness. Fair Lane, Richmond Hill, the Florida estates, they're monuments to what money can buy and what it can't. Ford could buy 1,300 acres. He couldn't buy peace. He could build a fortress. He couldn't fortify his mind against decline. He could create a world of beauty. He couldn't purge the ugliness from his soul. And here's the final, strangest irony of all. Today, Fair Lane is open to the public. Anyone can walk through the rooms where Ford listened to his servants through hidden intercoms. Anyone can stroll the gardens where he watched his birds. Anyone can visit the powerhouse that failed him at the end. The fortress is accessible to all. The man who built walls around himself has been, in death, opened up. His secrets have been excavated. His tunnels have been mapped. His surveillance system has been exposed. Everything he tried to hide has eventually been revealed. Maybe that's the real haunting. Not ghosts, not spirits, but the simple, inescapable fact that nothing stays buried forever. So, what should we take away from the haunting tale of Henry Ford's mansion empire? I think it comes down to this. Henry Ford was a genius. That's undeniable. He changed the world in ways that still affect us every single day. The car you drive, the way it was manufactured, the wages you're paid, all of these things trace back to Ford's innovations. But genius doesn't equal goodness. Innovation doesn't equal virtue. Success doesn't equal morality. Ford built an empire of mansions that still stand today. They're beautiful, they're impressive, they're filled with technological marvels. And they're also monuments to paranoia, control, hatred, and the desperate attempt of one man to create a world that matched his troubled vision. When you visit Fair Lane, and I encourage you to visit if you ever have the chance, look beyond the architecture. Look beyond the gardens. Look beyond the tourist presentation. Look for the tunnels. Look for the listening rooms. Look for the empty birdhouses. And remember that the man who built all of this died in darkness, in a flooded house, surrounded by the technology that had failed him and the servants who feared his security force. Remember that he died surrounded by luxury, and still, perhaps, tormented by the contradictions he could never resolve. That's the haunting tale of Henry Ford's mansion empire. Not ghosts, not spirits, just the echoes of a man who could build anything except peace with himself. Fair Lane Estate is located in Dearborn, Michigan, and is currently undergoing restoration. Tours are available to the public. The birdhouses are still mostly empty, but some visitors say they can still hear birdsong in the gardens. Make of that what you will. If you found this documentary fascinating, make sure to subscribe and hit that notification bell. We explore the hidden histories behind America's most mysterious locations, the stories they don't teach you in school. Until next time, keep questioning everything. And remember, the past isn't dead. It's not even past.